Hello again. Now we'll have, just before Christmas as it happens, which is a cosmic moment as regards liturgical prayer, our 9th conference on the sacred liturgy. So I'm following step by step in these weeks, at least for the time being, the great liturgical expert Romano Guardini, because he has some both vertical slants on things and very concrete horizontal ones. So it's a good combination. It's based on heaven but talks to earth. It's just what we need. As they say, some people are so heavenly minded that they're not no earthly use. He is very useful because it tells us how to behave and some of the pitfalls to avoid when we are involved in the work of the Lord. Now the problem is that we are always the same person, and therefore when we come into this element of serving the Lord, we need to be aware that we are actually not quite the same person, because we're entering into a role, and as in professional roles in general, one assumes a personality associated with that role. So too, in all that pertains to the cult, one needs to be aware that too much of what we are in our plain humanity, in no way changed or elevated, can be a nuisance, because we can be getting in the way of the people of God. And the angels aren't too amused when they see more self-seeking attention and so on. So let's look at a few issues when it comes to what we are to avoid when we come into the place of God. He talks about one specific question which is bound to be an area of conflict because we are carrying what we have in the way of habit. It's that of walking. Now, I have seen how not to walk in church. One sees people, even at the most sacred moments, really carrying on in the same mode as they would outside. More or less functionality. Getting from A to B is the point, no matter how sacred an object they're carrying in their hands. I once heard it put this way when in formation in France. If one is in the sanctuary and one is in the process of executing some function, for instance, as an acolyte, and one starts on a movement, so one moves from point A in the direction of point B. One does so with due liturgical otherness, not just an A to B straight line fix. A certain elevation of mode is required even in that. But then something else comes into the trajectory. One actually finds, in mid-course between A and B, that one should actually really be heading for point C. Now, the liturgical idiot will do this. He'll put the brakes on, he'll draw everyone's attention to the fact he's making a mistake, and he'll change course, and everyone will notice the error. Well, the true liturgist will do this. He will carry on with great majesty and dignity towards point B, even though the object of the exercise is quite useless at that point, because he knows he shouldn't be there. However, he is seen to be performing liturgically, and no one will notice a thing. So he carries on towards point B, duly invents something convincing to do, and then with the same majesty and dignity heads properly, calmly and unperturbedly for point C. So the effect is quite edifying, whereas in the first case, liturgical idiot has just ruined the liturgy. The same act, just the same way of handling it was not there. So, walking. I remember one time when I was a novice, the novice master saying, we nearly had lift-off in the cloister today. In other words, even in the cloister there is a certain pose, a movement in the monastic life, one does not show the hands. They actually go under the scapula or in the cowl, whatever it may be. It's all to do with monastic modesty. And they do not wave beside the body. That is anathema. So too, in the worship of God in the sanctuary, this element of how one walks enters into it. It's easy to put an altar server just like that in the sanctuary and presume that he'll cop on. No. Someone coming into something new has to be told how that something new is quite different from what he knows already. Otherwise, we are responsible for introducing more of the same thing, the banal, the daily, the workaday, also into the sanctuary. You can't blame the altar boys for what they've not been told. Educating altar servers is a whole art. It works on two levels. The spiritual, which can be quite interesting and well put, and also the concrete. So, one explains why, when one is walking, one does not walk as one does in the street. The hands do not wave. The body is actually in a mode of service and otherness, and therefore the hands are in an attentive mode as a sentinel, as a sentry on the great king in awaiting. So I'll quote here from this great author. Walking. How many people know how to walk? I remember actually commenting in one homily how when in Italy, in our monastery, which was actually a French monastery in Italy because we were from France, but we had both Italians in formation and we had quite a few from Africa because it was a French-speaking community. So these French-speaking Africans would come, and we had noticed that when it came to forming, for instance, some available scouts to help in the grand celebration on a Sunday morning, the Africans were by nature instinctively dignified. They had a certain liturgical bearing about them. They held themselves erect and attentively, and they were edifying to see. There was something about their bearing which was dignified, lent itself very well to liturgical praise in the body. Whereas we had noticed that it was just about as easy to get a piece of spaghetti to sit upright as it would be to get an Italian scout to stand erect. It was just a non-starter. In other words, culture enters into it, but it can be educated, and it makes a big difference whether one sees somebody lounging around, as he were in the bar, or somebody actually serving as a sentry at the altar. The whole people of God are edified or dismayed. And it depends on those who are forming these people. So, walking. How many people know how to walk? It is not hurry. It is not hurrying along at a kind of run. I remember actually one time in our parish, because it was a parish when I was growing up, run by Benedictines from Ampleforth and one from Buckfast, about 6 or 7 monks there, and they were a liturgical centre in Cardiff. Everything was done very well. And I remember one time the prior, as we got back from the High Mass, which was after the council now, because that carried on for a long while afterwards in English, well, half and half. And then we got to the sacristy, and the comment of the prior, who was main celebrant that day, was, in his very Ampleforthian accent, what is this? Is this the rat-catching season or something? In other words, he was not amused at speed when it came to liturgical walks, because we had to go right round the church when it came to the before and after. Liturgical processions were a part of the scene. And therefore, this question, how quickly one walks, is important. It is actually a problem if one is celebrant, because one has to educate those walking in front, the altar servers, as regards the speed. I remember being taught once, keep on saying peas and chips, peas and chips. In other words, it was a cadence which kept you keeping more or less like a soldier's pace without in any way getting out of sync, because one has to go at the same speed and not pull the celebrant behind. In other words, it has to be at the celebrant's pace, and therefore the altar people at the front have to be aware of what that pace is. The correct liturgical pace is not the same as just getting from A to B. That's functionality. A procession is one thing, going to the shop is another. So, it is not hurry, kind of run, or neither is it a shuffling along at a snail's pace. And should that happen, it's not really a help if an impatient celebrant mutters something unpleasant from the back, because that disrupts everything. Because if there's unpleasantness coming into it by an unpleasant remark from a celebrant to get things moving more quickly, it's devastating for the altar people, and that should not be happening, because the whole atmosphere must in any case be serene and loving. Any word which is in the way of improving must be in order to improve and not to dismantle the person's soul, because these things hurt. So anything happening in the liturgical sphere has to be completely loving. Otherwise the Lord of love is not served. Something else is, as though it were its own end. The end must always be encounter with Him and honouring Him, and also helping each other to encounter Him in that love which was there in the upper room. So, having said that, the altar boys must avoid also the other extreme. But a composed and firm forward movement. There is spring in the tread of a good walker. He lifts, not drags, his heels. He is straight, not stoop-shouldered. Now that's important, this erection of the body as a sentry. And his steps are sure and even. There is something uncommonly fine in the right kind of walking. It is a combination of freedom and discipline. One wonders how much there was in the way of relaxation in the Nazi goose step, but it did have certainly a complete synchronization of movement. And I often tell my altar boys, if we're, for instance, as we usually are, priest plus two, that is one on either side, it's one animal with 6 legs. So the genuflections happen all in complete sync, and therefore the altar boys must wait, but they must also have this radar system, ESP, where they pick up exactly what the celebrant is thinking and wanting, and then they act together. It can be done, and it's actually very edifying when one makes all together the genuflections just as one animal with 6 legs. It is poised as if the walker were carrying a weight. It proceeds with unhampered energy. In a man's walk there is a suggestion of bearing arms or burdens. In a woman's, an attractive grace that reflects an inner world of peace. Now that inner world of peace should always be there in anything liturgical. The way in which bodily we act should reproduce what the angels do without a body. We are, in a sense, their bodies, because they can't serve, they can't celebrate. They are just adoring, but they are adoring also with their spiritual being. We can't see them, but some people have, and they are prostrate. And we know at Knock that they were seen, and that they were going round all the time in silent adoration, in a circular movement. Well, they're there, and they expect of us not more of the same thing, but otherness, because they are watching. Our guardian angel in the first instance is very pained if he sees that we can't behave properly. It was shown to a child, not that long ago actually, on the Feast of the Guardian Angels, not this time round, last time round, the movement of the angels, the guardian angels of the children in the school mass there, at the moment of the consecration. They were all zooming towards the altar at the moment of consecration, but the priest had right next to him a very powerful angel watching over him. It was St. Michael. So we are surrounded by an angelic presence, and we want to be aware of that. Therefore, anything which takes away from that otherness of angelic mode is unliturgical and defeating the object of the exercise. And if we can't get rid of that even from our church composure, it means that we shouldn't really be helping the people of God to do what we can't do ourselves. We have to lead as mystagogues the people of God into something mysterious, not something profane. It's not a club or a place for encountering each other. We encounter each other, yes, but in God. And if we don't encounter God, we only encounter each other, and we upset God and our guardian angels, and we don't really encounter ourselves properly. We're actually damaging our own souls without knowing it. Now, and when the occasion is religious, what a beautiful thing walking can be. It is a genuine act of divine worship. I remember when an altar boy there in that Benedictine parish where I was brought up, the way in which the liturgy was executed was very edifying. The Sunday Mass there was fully sung, 11:15. Even after the council now, it carried on, but changing bit by bit more into English, but fully sung, with lots of incense, an army of altar boys. We had also the 6 altar boys there with the small candles when it came to they came out at the preface with incense there behind the Thora, and they were there, and they would be for the Sanctus, and then they go off after the consecration back. So all that was saying that we kept a lot of the ceremonial, and it can be done in the New Rite. It still happens in the Vatican, and it could certainly be done. But anyway, what I remember was that the way that we would come out of the sacristy with majestic chant and organ music was actually very, very moving. It was really a coming into something majestic, and it is something that people do somehow respond to. An introit, an entrance into glory is a dovetailing. A casual crashing is quite another thing, when one just comes up and says good morning, and everyone says good morning, Father. That's very profane, whereas this otherness of coming into something with a whole ethos of creating an atmosphere, and in the movement of the body towards physically approaching God, is something which helps to create straight away a very powerful atmosphere and a reminder that we're going towards. Now, merely to walk into a church in reverent awareness that we are entering the house of the Most High, and in a special manner into His presence, may be to walk before the Lord. Now that's a Hebrew expression. To walk in Hebrew in the his file form, this reflexive form, is a kind of being, existing, moving around in the presence of, and indeed to have a way of life. But in the presence of the Lord is before the face of the Lord in Hebrew, Paneh Yahweh. And this element of being under His gaze is what we are doing all the time. It comes still in the liturgical language. In the second Eucharistic prayer there, we thank God for finding us worthy to stand in His presence and serve Him. Well, that's coram Deo, before God, in the presence of God. We're actually standing there disarmed before the gaze of God. Therefore, that demands a certain erectness and attention. Walking in a religious procession ought not to be what so often it is, pushing along out of step and staring about. Now that's very bad. If altar boys stare around, they're not at all formed, because a child is curious by nature, but it's an unwritten rule, and it always has been, that one does not look at the people. The celebrant, up until the changes, was instructed very clearly when turning around to greet the people with "the Lord be with you." He was not actually looking them in the eyes. There was a sort of engagement without the eyes. He was not to lose recollection. The way in which altar boys behave in the same way in the sanctuary as they would in a cinema is showing that they have not been educated with regard to what liturgy is about, because at that point they have to be very much aware of what they're doing, and if they are engaging with their parents or anyone else, they're actually not really at all aware of the nature in which an altar boy is reproducing the function of the angels. Therefore, one only looks at what pertains to the cult. If an altar boy has the function of helping the priest with holding the communion plate at Holy Communion, he should be told not to be gazing distractedly at the people. That again is an element of devotion to the Lord. One thinks about the presence that is there. Because people can be put off by an altar boy quite easily if they're helping at that point in a distracted way. And it's even worse if one leaves altar servers there in the sanctuary sitting and chatting while Holy Communion is being distributed, that is really unedifying. So if that is happening, they should be dealt with immediately without lacking in charity, but these are capital offences with regard to liturgical behaviour. It's showing that they're not at all aware of the sacrality of the function. Indeed, sitting at all in the sanctuary when the tabernacle is open is questionable. Traditionally, as long as the tabernacle is open, the altar service should always be kneeling, giving an example to the people. Of course, they can be used in a well-prepared liturgy. They can, if there is a certain dignity about the way in which Holy Communion is distributed, they can be carrying on their function as acolytes. That is an intelligent way of using the altar boys and keeping them active, because one of the problems about modern liturgy is that they don't give enough things to do to the altar service. But these can be ministries which can be carried out very well. As they have been carrying the candles for the gospel, honouring the gospel, so too they can carry the candles at Holy Communion. They can, if there's one point of distribution, or two or whatever, they can be at either side. If it's done under both kinds, then there is one central point of distribution there, and also an altar boy will be needed to hold the communion plate, lest the precious blood drop. Because if it's done by intinction, then you need all this at one point, and it's a central point there in which the Lord is honoured and shown to be very much the unifying point of the assembly. A multiplication unduly of many points of distribution is questionable in different parts of the church, because it takes away from the unity of the mensa, the Lord's table. That's something which ought to be looked at, because it's become actually banal, just putting any point at all in any part of the church as a point of Holy Communion. It is actually taking away somehow from the mystery of all sharing the one bread and one chalice, that element of seeing visibly that we're doing actually an act of union, receiving the same host from what has been consecrated at the altar itself. But that is a complex issue. It's only in monasteries really that is actually seen to be done properly, where actually there are fewer people present and it can be done more easily. But one does feel there that that's the way instinctively that it should be done, that what is consecrated should be what is received, and that there should be one point of distribution where the people really feel that actually coming to share the same supper of the Lord. All that to say that there is a problem with movement, too much movement going on in church, because all the hurried movement as though we were in a supermarket doesn't help. Any liturgical movement, even on the part of the people, a procession to receive the Lord, for instance, or an offertory procession, has also to have that certain otherness about it. It's not just displacement from one point to another. There's an element of dignity about it. So liturgical displacement of body is actually something which ought to be looked at even for the people. And what is worse than people coming up to Holy Communion in procession and talking to each other in the communion procession, that is really devastating. It shows that on several levels we haven't really understood what we're doing. So that moment there is very important. There is a great help actually in the way in which still in some churches it is done that one receives in a line at Holy Communion, because there's a certain calmness about staying in a line. It's even better if one is actually able to kneel still, because then there's that littleness coming in and waiting for the Lord of hosts to pass in a feeling of humble beggarliness without being rushed to move from A to B. The problem with coming in a large queue is that there is that mentality of the McDonald's queue there, and it doesn't really in the same way have that notion of the mystical waiting for the Lord to come. So calmness of movement is a great help, and interiorized liturgy is a great help rather than a noisy one. To escort the Blessed Sacrament through the city streets or through the fields, his own possession, the men marching like soldiers, the married women in the dignity of motherhood, the young girls in the innocent charm of youth, the young men in their restrained strength, all praying in their hearts, should be a sight of festive gladness. So that's the other element of processions outside the Mass itself. We actually, on a First Friday, we have a Mass with also a benediction, but we also have a procession, a small procession each first Friday, and there is that element of claiming the Lord's rights over society. One is not shy, one is actually letting the Lord own and claim what belongs to him. That is one big difference between our cult, our worship, and Protestant worship, which is purely mental in a sense. We have that physicity about it, and therefore we are able to honour the incarnational mode of presence of the Lord. He's truly present, and therefore we are truly honouring him with all also our body and movement. So in that sense, processions can happen also outside the Mass itself, and it's a pity that they have not quite stopped, but stopped in many areas, because they do actually help us to, as it were, focus. We need more than just the mind, and many beautiful things can be sung in procession. There are also moments in which we can be entering into contemplative mode. We still have certain things like pilgrimages and rosary processions and things even in the Irish culture which are still lingering on from the past, which are fairly functional and work and tend to be also quite reverent. We are calmly in a mode of prayer when we are in a rosary procession, for instance. It just works, it carries us on, and it stops us from talking to each other. These work very well, and why fix what is not broken? So what we have, let us use well. A penitential procession should be supplication in visible form. There is this element then of what we are trying to express. We have in Italy, in all country parishes, still the procession of the dead Christ, Cristo Morto. The dead Christ, a big statue of the dead Christ, is carried through all the streets of the village in Italy on Good Friday. There's more physicity about praise and worship in old Latin countries like Italy and Spain and Portugal, and it's nice to see that. Even people who might not be able to be regular on a weekly basis do take part in these things, and they are also a claiming of the rights of God over society. They don't do any harm at all. And the moments also that can be interspersed with good meditations, they can be harnessed. These things which are in public and popular devotion are still rich in their potential for evangelization. Even when we have a funeral, that could be exploited, because it's one thing to just go away carrying the dead person to be buried and talking while doing it, another one to be praying also in a meaningful sense for him. The rosary is a great help because it keeps us from talking to each other, and we can say it well and indeed gain merit for ourselves and for the deceased person. So these things do need to be harnessed. They are part of our cult. We do displace ourselves physically. We can do it badly or we can do it well. All that we to do for God should be done with thought. So walking is the outward mark of man's essential and peculiar nobility. It is the privilege of man alone to walk erect, his movement in his own power and choice. The upright carriage denotes the human being. But we are more than human beings. We are, as the Bible calls us, the generation of God. We have been born of God into newness of life. So Christ lives in us. So our body then is also to become itself a tabernacle of the Most High. In that sense, it does matter whether we are well clad, especially if we have anything to do which is public and liturgical. It is not edifying to see a person not clad properly coming into the sanctuary area. It doesn't do any harm even to form the altar service from an early age into a certain dignity, even though they might be concealed by something over their normal clothes. Even the fact of coming well dressed rather than badly dressed into the sanctuary is already a mark of honour for the king being served. But in general, one should not dress down to come to the king's palace. We're coming to somebody who has a greater nobility than the Queen of England, than the Pope. We're coming to Jesus Christ himself, the Lord of Lords. And so the king's palace deserves a certain bearing even in what we wear, and also cleanliness. It's really very sad when one sees, especially children, not at all taught that the hands should be clean and not carrying things like writing on the palm of the hand and that kind of thing, especially for receiving in the hand the Lord of glory. And some even actually present their hands with gloves on. All this shows that one has not understood the physicity of our cult. Things actually matter with regard to the way that we comport ourselves in the house of God. He that eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me and I in him. These are his words. Christ grows in us and we grow in him, until being thoroughly formed by him, we attain to the full stature of Jesus Christ, and everything we do or are, whether we eat or sleep, our work, our recreation, our pleasures, and our pains are all taken up into the Christ life. Now that's saying that actually there's a continuity between, therefore, our bearing in church and our bearing out of church. We don't suddenly change into a different personality. There has to be that ongoing element of living out the grace. Therefore, we don't become ungraced. I remember hearing this from a Protestant one time, criticizing Catholics in the area about the way that their words were not graceful. There was an element of bad language coming in which he didn't find edifying. And it is true that we should not have any word on our lips which have become the throne of God, which are in discontinuity with that moment of encounter at Holy Communion. If we're giving the Lord our tongue as a throne, it has to be a clean tongue, not engaged in things which are in any way offensive to that majesty which is still there in our hearts at that point afterwards. And even the act of talking when we still have the Lord in us is questionable. The Lord himself does say, "Me you do not always have with you." We should be giving all our attention as long as the Lord is there. Therefore, the element of waiting for a word, even after Holy Communion, after Mass is over, to receive fully all the Lord has prepared for us, is a delicacy to the King of Kings. He might have something to tell us, and we don't listen, and we don't catch his word because we're fabricating our own words. We can't listen to him and talk to others at the same time. It just can't be done. So that cushioning of the presence matters. The Lord needs an echo, a silent pause to get through. The consciousness of this mystery should pass in all its joyous strength and beauty into our very manner of walking. The command to walk before the Lord and to be perfect is a profound figure of speech. We ought both to fulfill the command and illustrate the figure, but in sober reality. Beauty of this order is not the product of mere wishing. I just conclude this first half by mentioning one thing. It's some remark that was made by the novelist Henry Fielding in the novel Joseph Andrews. He was writing around the, I think, 1700s or so, maybe the 1800s, but it's an English classic. And there's one important figure in the novel. It's the parson, the Anglican parson. It's Mr. Adams, the Reverend Adams. And he is a classical scholar, but he's an interesting man, and he is portrayed as being actually quite a good celebrant or preacher. And he has this comment to one of his parishioners: "Mr. Adams, in a surplice, is one man. Mr. Adams, without a surplice, is quite another." Now, what he was saying is this, in the novel that is, but it was a point that applies. Once one has put on the sacred vestments, one is in a role, and more of the other at that point is out of place. Giggling and laughing and talking about football is not what we do when we are in sacred vestments. And a fortiori, once in the sanctuary and engaged in the liturgical movement itself, at that point we are doing the role of the angels, and anything of the other person in us at that point is not at that point in its place. We need to be aware of what we're doing, aware of whom we're serving, and also aware of whom we're trying to help to come into contact with him, the people of God for whom we are mystagogues. A little pause there, and we'll come back now in a few seconds. So, we return to the use of the hands in one specific gesture. It's still there. It's that of striking the breast. Now, there is one element which has been somewhat downplayed recently, I mean in the last 40 years, which is recent in liturgical history. It's that of the crescendo. In ancient liturgical practice, there is, in every liturgical family, and it's still very much there in the East, a coming gradually into majesty. The East has a very prolonged preparation. It actually already starts at the High Vespers in the evening, and the priest may not celebrate unless those have been done properly before. In other words, it's a whole movement. But then there's the immediate preparation in the area behind the screen. It's what they call the iconostasis. On the left there's a door, as well as on the right, but the one on the left there has behind there where things are happening way before it starts. He has all kinds of prayers and gestures to be done where he's preparing the bread. In fact, the two breads, because one is to be consecrated and one is not. And the one not will be the blessed bread, but given as the antidodon to the people who are not receiving Holy Communion afterwards. But anyway, the progression is there in the putting on of vestments and so on, until eventually there is the first entry and it starts properly. But much of that also would have been in the West. It's still there in the monastic life, where one is well formed into coming gradually into mode of celebration, because it all happens in the sacristy in silence and so on before one comes out of procession, and often there'll be an office anyway before the Mass itself. So things happen there automatically. But also there would have been, in the education of priests until the changes, the obligation actually of saying the various prayers of vesting. Now that had the advantage of cutting out talk. People knew that the priest was not free to talk. And in fact, because on a Sunday I have at 1 o'clock there still the Latin Mass there in the old rite, that's the public one. Well, that actually still being there, and also on the Sunday we have the obligation of blessing and exorcising the salt and the water. That all happens there in the sacristy before one actually comes out. So people know perfectly well that one is not there to do anything else. If they want confession, I think that's a different matter. They can come before all that starts. But when they see this, the priest is half-vested, that's already happening. So it's a great help, because it means that when it comes to the actual moment of coming to the altar, one is already in quiet mode. Now, if one goes into a situation, for instance, to concelebrate in some event, might be a funeral or something, one will find that it's all happening in the sacristy. I mean, the priests are having a great chat about all the news they've got to catch up on since they last met. Well, it's not the best way to come into the altar, where actually one can't just like that humanly change mode, because all that clutter is coming with one. So if one is in any situation, one can make up for that by educating the altar servers to an atmosphere of silence in the sacristy, and also any people who might be there with them, a sacristan or a mother or whatever. If there has to be someone there to accompany the children, they have to be taught also that they are in a place of silence, and a sign can be put there, and it's actually in the instructions given, the modern ones now, that the actual sacristy is a place of silence. There are certain things which have come through in all the instructions, and that's one of them which is actually still there. And so that's just to be borne in mind. That I've actually seen that in a Dublin parish, that instruction in the modern introduction there is actually, it was framed and put in the laminated thing there in the sacristy for all to see. In other words, a message like that does help, because people know what the norm is and gives them a clear message. And so one then can also, once the altar boys are there, pray with them. Now in a normal Protestant service, there will be prayer happening before the service starts. It happens in the kind of vestry area, and they grow into a prayer mode which is not based on set prayers at all, but they ask the Holy Spirit to come. Now that can be in some shape or form happening also in our situation. One can have either a laminated prayer for the altar servers to say amongst themselves, or one can pray with them. It doesn't have to be a set prayer, because inviting the Holy Spirit to come in a meaningful way to them might draw their attention more than just a hurried set prayer. In other words, one can get them in prayer mode before they start, and it'll instruct them spontaneously about what actually they're about to do. A word thrown in there in prayer will actually hit them. What we're about to do, we need the help of God to do it properly, and of the holy angels who are right there with us. And also when it comes to coming back, one greets the cross, and then we'll greet each other, and but then it's all done in dignity. But there again, one can pray, and one can... In other words, this element of not crashing in and out of God is important. So anyway, when it comes to the altar itself, there had been in the past this gradual going up towards, and therefore this element of striking the breast would come in. There would be the people in the person of the altar boys saying that there and striking their breast 3 times, and then the priest, well, actually the other way around, the priest would first of all say his I confess, and would receive forgiveness, and then he'd be able to, that was the thought behind it, forgive the people, as it were. Once he was cleansed, he could actually then be in a situation to proclaim healing and forgiveness for the people. So all that to say that we need to make up for what is there now very quickly, because what's actually happened is this: whereas before one was able to just be carried by an automatic preparation of going gradually into the Almighty and not crashing into him as an equal, and because the whole ethos was going upwards and gradually towards going up, physically going up, and having been purified first at the foot of the altar, now one is going very quickly to the altar, and very quickly, because all the trimmings have been toned down, one is going into more of what they're coming from. This element of saying good morning and so on, it's questionable. It does engage, but it's a very profane way of engaging. The proper salutation is actually the liturgical one, which comes from the early church. This, the Lord be with you, or whatever it might be, is actually a liturgical mode which can be done meaningfully, because to add another human greeting after that is to show that the first one wasn't sufficient, it was irrelevant, whereas the relevant one is the one that was making up oneself in actually disobedience, because that's not the correct way to greet the people at the altar. It's different. The mode of encounter is superior and not just profane. And there's a whole way actually of going straight into liturgical mode in anything which one says at that point. A few words of introduction, making personal, making relevant, making pertinent to the congregation present and the event and the day and the reading, that can happen in a few well-prepared words which straight away set the tone. This chit-chat is not the place, and it's actually quite difficult to prepare in a few words a thought which is actually valid at that point, but it makes a difference. A word about the saint, a word about the reading, whatever it might be, which actually brings out straight away the theme, is a good help to start the liturgy properly. So that's the good use of the modern way that we have of celebrating without the automatic mode that we had before, of having the work done for us by the rite itself. So all that to say, therefore, we need this element of being aware that we're bringing people into something that we have now, to some extent, to create ourselves. It's not automatic as it was before. We have to be experts at creating an atmosphere, and that atmosphere must radiate from our presence. So, the striking of the breast, then, it can be questioned whether it should be a loud thump, or whether it should be a tiny suggestion, a vestigial one. Well, probably something in between is the correct answer, but it should be a genuine act of contrition. It's been put now in the threefold striking. The Confiteor has been put in its correct form, because it was shortened before in the English that we had, without necessity, but now it's been brought, the 3 thumps are there, and they can be done meaningfully. In the old rite, one is in a state of inclination, profound bow when one does it, but some kind of bow doesn't do any harm. Indeed, here in the Hermitage, when I'm using that particular Confiteor, the old one there, I actually always face the altar at that point, because it's to God that is actually said, even though one has actually faced the people to greet them at the beginning and to say a few words. But at least this point is addressed towards God out of all humility, and we're going together to ask for healing and forgiveness. The body enters into it, and this element of bowing and striking the breast in genuine humility is a very telling mode. It's actually something very precious we've managed to keep across all the centuries, and why not do it properly if it's still there? So, we recognize at that point something of our state as we reproduce the gesture of the publican in the temple. We're not standing erect and talking to ourselves, praying within ourselves like the Pharisee, "Aren't I great, Lord?" And the applause in church is something of that, isn't it? When if we actually have that notion of striking our breast, reproducing what the publican had, they're not worthy to raise his eyes to heaven, "Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner," he went home more justified than the Pharisee. But if we go after a great performance of liturgy with all kinds of applause given to ourselves at the end, we might be in the situation of the Pharisee, who has gone away saying to himself, "How great a success I am in my liturgical performance, and people have been gratifying me," even though that might not be actually put in his mind. It's actually there in the background, because a lot of what we do, if we're not careful, can be made impure by the impure motive. Purity of intention means that we want to honour God alone, and we don't get into his place of glory. People can actually be somehow hijacking the limelight by using the slots of liturgy as a place of having an audience. People seem to have an itch to want to be seen in church. I remember hearing that from a monk in Italy one time, commenting on how people like to be seen at the ambo. So we also have one thump still kept in the old Eucharistic prayer before Holy Communion. You've got the priest who does the to us also who are sinners. That happens there. The priest can do it, and also the concelebrants, if the first Eucharistic prayer is used, and the people mentally can unite themselves to that. And if they want to do it themselves, it doesn't do any harm, because they're showing what they think of themselves. Not much, not great shakes before the Divine Majesty. But the other, it's not there anymore, but Pope Benedict actually does mention it in one of his writings. Maybe he was already before he was Pope, but he writes quite a bit about liturgy. When he does speak about this element of striking the breast in the spirit of the liturgy, and he does indicate that it can still be done there with regard to the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God. It was there in the old rite that there was, each time one was saying, "Have mercy, Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us." It was there 3 times, well, the last one, grant us peace. But that can still be done. It doesn't do any harm at all. Some people also still do it at the... it was there before of obligation, but quite a few. You can still do it now if one wants to, with regard to "Behold the Lamb of God," and then one replies, "Lord, I am not worthy." It can still be done there. They're spontaneous, natural ways of expressing, if they're done with the heart, are genuine nothingness before receiving the Lord, and showing that genuinely we're not worthy, because when we think what we're about to do, it is the right time to express our littleness. Because if all this then is just made abstract in view of something purely mental and cerebral, then, well, it can work, but it has the danger of also making us forget, because we actually are human beings with a body and a soul, and when the body actually enters into it, it is a reminder for the soul. Because people presumed that by simplifying things would go on in a more purified way. In fact, it wasn't always the case. When things visibly disappear, one after the other, in quick succession, in fact, God is also stripped mentally in our mind's eye of his greatness. The care that we give is an indication of what we think of our King. So, this element then of honouring the Lord with our physicity is important. I just want to conclude with one thing. It's the question of that same fist which has been used to express the sorrow at not being worthy to receive the Lord is, in the present way of celebrating in Ireland, possibly the way also that he will be honoured at the moment of receiving him, if one offers one's hand as a throne. Now, it is true that in the early church, for a while, there was the possibility of receiving in the hand, but it would seem that they had some linen over it to protect it in some situations, and it was held by 2 servers at either end. But the way in which it was done, if it was received directly on the palm, was it was received not in the way that we do it now. What actually happened, we know this from the testimony of the Church Fathers, is that the throne of God in those days was presented by the more worthy of the two hands, the right one, not the left one as is done now, and the other one was a support underneath it, the left one. But then, what happened? It was adored, and in some situations it was actually placed against the eyes. That's a curious one, in adoration. But the way in which it was received was quite different. It was received by lowering the head to the host and receiving it on the tongue, licking it up, without taking it with the other hand. That actually was maintained, strange enough, in the Anglican communion. They don't take the other hand. That's the way it was carried on in there, and they always carried on they kept the altar rails until fairly recently anyway. They always had the altar rails in the Anglican communion. That's just interesting that out of force of habit things carried on there. But this question there, just to be aware that there is that feeling that it was not to be handled just as ordinary bread, because even in the centuries when that might have been happening, it wasn't quite the same as what has come to be now. And actually fairly quickly that was stopped. Just to be aware that there is a massive tradition for the way in which it became normal there until fairly recently, that it was received, given by the priest on the tongue. And that, by the way, is still the norm. Just the other has become an indult which has become normalized. But the traditional way is still, and no one can take it away. That is basically the way in which in the West it was done, and may still always be done. And in fact, we know from the popes, the way that they have spoken, that actually that is the way that they would prefer it. And we know from the way that Pope Benedict himself always gave for the people kneeling and on the tongue, that he was discreetly indicating his own preference. But John Paul II also made it known. In fact, he did say at one occasion quite clearly, "I do not hide the fact that I am not in favour of this practice." He did say with regard to receiving in the hand. So just be aware, there is this element there that people tend to confuse the issue when they actually hark back to the early church. It's not quite so simple, because the early church practice was not exactly what we have now. It was very reverent. Okay, all that to say, it's still bodily language, because whatever we do with the body, it has to be done in a mode of worship, not in the same way as we do something profane. Because if we do, for instance, receive the bread of angels in the same way as receive a piece of ordinary bread, then it is also, for a child doing it for the first time, a lack of education, because he doesn't really distinguish the difference. Because in fact, in practice, the child is taught by visible things, not just mental things. So things which are actually visible are very powerful messages for a child, and the children are the Catholics of tomorrow. So what is the first message is the very important one that will cling and stay. So it's important that these children, whether they be altar servers or not, is the first education to sanctity, to otherness, to the communion of saints in which we are engaged in the line of where we're coming from, not the first to get it right after 2 millennia. In other words, we look back also to where we're coming from, and what was good enough for our parents should also be good enough for us in regard to care, attention, honour and glory.